we're just going to talk really quickly about urbanization and inequality. Okay, so there are a lot of words and a lot of definitions and a lot of terms to know on the next couple of slides. So a lot of them are just straight definitions, and I think that's probably the best way for you to study for this, because if you understand the definitions of these specific terms, more so on the next couple of slides, then it will definitely help you understand all of these concepts. So urbanization refers to the growth of urban areas due to the relocation of people from rural areas to cities. And this is a result of global change. It's also a result of industrialization, which often precedes urbanization. So as advances in technology and increased need for workers, as those needs increase, it draws individuals to the cities from rural locations. So that's what urbanization is. We're going from a rural location to an urban location. And it's usually because of industrialization. You know, we have these advances in technology, jobs are increasing in the urban area, and it also, urbanization can also be, you know, the effect of a decrease in agriculture, or a decrease in the emphasis of agriculture in a specific society. So in the US, urbanization rate is about 80%, and we measure urbanization rate including urban and suburban areas. So it's basically how much of the population is not living in a rural area is really what the urbanization rate means. So in the US, it's about 80%, which is pretty high compared to the rest of the world. The world average is about 50%. So that's about 1 in every 2 people living across the entire world will live in either an urban area or a suburb. And like I said before, as countries' emphasis on agriculture decreases, many individuals leave these rural areas in search of more social services. This is known as rural flight. So that basically, many people will live in these rural areas because they're depending on agriculture. So if they're sustaining themselves, or if they're selling the agriculture, they're selling their crops, that's how they make a living. But because of urbanization, there are more jobs, possibly easier, possibly higher paying, that may open up in the city. So they're going to leave. A lot of people are going to leave from these rural areas. And as these rural areas become even less populated, even more sparsely populated, their social services as well are going to decline. So social services mean schools. There might be school closures, and the most local school for your kids is going to be 3-4 miles away. Same thing with hospitals, same thing with doctors' offices. As people move away, social services move away as well. And that's what we call rural flight. So a lot of times people will leave these rural areas because other people are leaving, specifically because there are no more social services in these areas. And then they move, to urban and suburban areas, and they can find those services more easily. So suburbanization, as opposed to urbanization, refers to the movement of people from urban areas to suburban areas. So first we talked about urbanization. We had people moving from rural areas to urban areas, and now we're talking about suburbanization, which is the next step. People move from urban areas to suburbs. So a suburb is a community located outside of a city that is less densely populated than a city, but it's more populated than the rural areas around it. And the suburbs are usually connected to the city. A lot of the inhabitants of suburbs will maintain their jobs in the city, in the actual urban area, but live in the suburb. And it's usually a result of increased wealth. So urban sprawl occurs when the population of urban areas declines because of movement to more remote locations, like these suburbs. They may start as rural areas, but as more people move over, they become suburbs. And this urban sprawl, this moving of urban areas, the spreading out of people from urban areas, also may lead to what we call urban blight, which is sort of the opposite of gentrification, which we'll talk about in a minute, that I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with. But urban blight is a phenomenon in which less functioning areas of large cities degrade as a result of urban decline. So as people in wealth leave these areas, they're going to become desolate, dangerous, and they may experience a decrease in social amenities and opportunities. So it's very similar to rural flight, urban blight. When people leave the areas, these social amenities and these opportunities are going to leave as well. So maybe the poverty rate might increase, the crime rate is going to go up a little bit as well. And that's what happens, that's a result of urban sprawl. On the other hand, we have gentrification, and that's a process of urban renewal. So it's basically the exact opposite of urban blight. And that's the renewal in which wealthy residents return to a city to restore the existing infrastructure. And this is happening all over the country, especially because a lot of people who maybe have come from wealthy families who are not making as much money as their families are moving to these locations. They still have more money than the locals, but they feel the economic need to move to these locations, and they cause this gentrification, which has its positives and its negatives, which we'll talk about. So gentrification may change the economic and demographic layout of the city, and there are both positive and negative effects, like I just said. There may be an increase in the tax base, so maybe it becomes a more wealthy area. The price of land goes up there, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but it may drive out locals who have lived there for years. So people who are living there, who have been living there their entire lives, who don't make too much money, when the taxes go up, they don't have enough money and they have to leave their homes because of this gentrification. So there are definitely arguments to be made for both sides of gentrification. And a little bit about inequality and segregation. There are many different types of inequality and segregation, but right now we're just going to really quickly focus on spatial inequality and residential segregation. And I put that little map over there to the right. It just shows America. It groups them by regions, and it's color-coded. Yellow is low segregation, residential. Orange is high, and red is very extreme areas of residential segregation. So you can see a lot of the coastal areas, they experience higher levels of segregation, of residential segregation. So spatial inequality occurs when individuals who are geographically grouped by socioeconomic status do not receive access to the same resources. So these resources may be environmental, like clean water, or services like medical care and education. And that can even be tied to that sort of rural flight that we were talking about. When they leave rural areas, schools close, hospitals close, and that contributes to spatial inequality. So the people that are living there do not have access to the same resources as do people, say, who could afford to live in the city and have everything at the tips of their fingers. They can walk down the block and hit a hospital. So spatial inequality is definitely a big issue. And residential segregation also, it's the separation of groups into different neighborhoods by race, ethnicity, or socioeconomic status. Okay, so this is a list. I will go over all of them. These are some important definitions when we're talking about social mobility and inequality. You should definitely know them and understand them for the MCAT. You should be able to identify them. So meritocracy is a stratification system based on personal effort. Stratification is, just the way sort of caste system in socioeconomic gradient in a country. So in a meritocracy, the system is based on personal effort or merit to establish a social standing. And it's important to note that no society solely stratifies based on effort. Meritocracy is sort of like an ideal system, but there's really no society that is just going to, put you in a socioeconomic class based on your effort. Social mobility is the ability to move up or down within a social stratification system. Upward mobility obviously indicates an increase in social class. So if upward mobility is possible, we like to believe that upward mobility is possible. And in a lot of cases it is. But I think it's probably exaggerated to certain extents for multiple reasons. Downward mobility indicates a decrease in social class. I think you could argue that downward mobility is a lot easier than upward mobility. Intergenerational mobility indicates a change in social class between parents and children within the same family. So say we have a blue-collar working class parent, say the father is a plumber and the mother doesn't work. And they have a child who becomes an extremely wealthy neurosurgeon. That would be an example of intergenerational mobility. Intragenerational mobility describes the difference in social class between members of the same generation. So say we have that same kid who is a neurosurgeon and his brother is an electrician, or his cousin is maybe a trade worker, or maybe is unemployed for a very long time, or for whatever reason, does not belong to the same does not belong to the same social class as a member of the same generation. That is intragenerational mobility. So social reproduction refers to the structures in a society that transmit and reinforce social inequality across generations. Education, for example, unequal access to education. If you don't have money and you live in a less wealthy area that does not have access to good education, that affects your children. If they don't get a good education, then it's going to be much more difficult for them as an adult to attain that upward mobility. And that's what social reproduction is. It's the passing of this social inequality, and it's the structures in society that passes these social inequalities to the generation. So it's sort of like that cycle that needs to be broken. Class consciousness and false consciousness. So class consciousness is the set of beliefs a person holds regarding their socioeconomic status. So we all have, to a degree of class consciousness. We know who we are, we know where we stand, and that's all that is. It's just the set of beliefs that you hold regarding it. How, who I'm supposed to interact with, what I'm supposed to eat, what I'm supposed to wear, what I'm supposed to do, what job I'm supposed to have. And that class consciousness is what you believe, the set of beliefs that a person holds regarding their own socioeconomic status. Whereas false consciousness is the inability of people to recognize the inequality and exploitation of their class because of prevalent views and beliefs that legitimize the class system. So maybe there's an essential worker that is making minimum wage, and it is not a living wage, and they are being told that they're not being paid a minimum wage because they're not doing work that is worth a minimum wage. You will have millions and millions of people who will agree with that statement. And some people might argue that that is an example of false consciousness, because it is a belief that contributes to the inequality and exploitation of the working class. And it's because there are prevalent views and beliefs that legitimize that class system. So you may have people that have much higher paying jobs and that are in higher social classes that are saying, I don't think you should be paid for doing this. I don't think you should get a living wage for doing that, because that's how it is. That's how it's always been. And that contributes to this false consciousness because it's just the general belief, and it's just part of the culture. Okay, we are almost done. And I just wanted to really quickly mention the socioeconomic gradient in health, because of course it does affect healthcare. In the US, there is a huge disparity in healthcare based on socioeconomic status. And one of the reasons, not the entire reason, but one of the reasons is because healthcare must be bought in the US like other products. So an individual's wealth and socioeconomic status is going to directly affect their personal health and hygiene. So when someone is sick, if they do not have money in America, if they do not have health insurance, they do not have money, they are much less likely to seek treatment for it. So it's pretty intuitive that the lower your socioeconomic status is, the less likely you're going to seek treatment, the less likely you're going to have access to adequate treatment. And all of this contributes to the socioeconomic gradient. And not only does it take into account an individual's ability to pay directly for healthcare, but it also takes into account their type of job, their access to food, environmental factors, and all of this affects your health. So we don't just have to think about access to a doctor's office or access to a hospital, but I mean, there are dirty jobs. There are types of jobs that are, dangerous. So people of a lower socioeconomic status, for example, maybe they're a coal worker or they work in the coal mines. Those jobs can be very dangerous, and there are, health consequences, respiratory issues that these people have, and it's because of the socioeconomic gradient. Access to food is another one. Organic food, quality food is extremely expensive. If you need 500 calories for a meal and you want to buy really healthy food, fruits, vegetables, salad, it's going to cost you $40, $50. Whereas you can go, if you only have $4 or $5 to spend on a meal, you can go down to the local McDonald's and you can get all of your calories in a really fatty processed hamburger. So access to food is another big one, and environmental factors as well. There are higher rates of pollution in communities that are of lower socioeconomic status. So, environmental factors like pollution, also, water pollution, air pollution, that all factors into this gradient, and it all factors into, how an individual's health is affected. So those with higher socioeconomic statuses have better outcomes in healthcare, pretty obvious. And that could be within the same country or across countries. So, I mean, someone with a higher socioeconomic status within the same country will have better outcomes than someone with a lower one in that same country. And we can also take countries as an average. So if we have a more wealthy country, a wealthier country, they're going to have better outcomes than, a less wealthy country. So it's within the country and across countries as well. So the socioeconomic gradient is prevalent across the world. And yep, it affects all healthcare systems, even those with socialized medicine, to varying degrees, of course. But like we did say before, it is not the only issue in the healthcare system. The payment part is not the only issue. It is a large issue, but it is not the only one.